Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. There is a silence spreading through America's corridors of power, not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. Once the nation that sent humans to the moon, that built the world's great universities and inspired generations of dreamers, believed deeply in its own genius. Today, even its former leaders confess that there are no talented people left to run the country. What has happened to the republic of ideas? What has become of the nation that once measured greatness, not in wealth, but in wisdom? This is not merely a political crisis. It is a civilizational one. The United States, amid its wealth and power, has lost something far more precious, its moral imagination. Talent still exists in its classrooms, in its laboratories, in the quiet dedication of its citizens, but it has been exiled from the institutions that once elevated it. As the world watches America turn its politics into theater and its governance into spectacle, one question grows unavoidable. Can a nation that forgets how to serve still remember how to lead? In this episode, we explore the deeper meaning behind Donald Trump's stark words, not as a partisan outburst, but as a mirror reflecting the spiritual fatigue of empire. We will trace the decline of America's moral and intellectual foundation, the marketization of its knowledge, and the fading magnetism that once drew the world's brightest minds to its shores. Because the crisis of talent is not about intelligence, it is about purpose. And the restoration of purpose, Sachs reminds us, begins not with power, but with humility, the courage to remember what a nation is for. Donald Trump's declaration that the United States no longer has talented people to run the country is more than a cynical remark. Beneath the bravado and political theater, it reveals a profound anxiety about the American condition, an awareness, however crude, that something vital has eroded in the nation's moral and intellectual fabric. In the language of political economy, this is not simply a lament about personnel. It is a symptom of institutional exhaustion, the slow decay of a system that once married expertise with purpose, but now confuses noise with leadership. Trump, in his own populist idiom, voices a sentiment that many Americans intuitively share, that the state no longer functions as an instrument of competence, that its leaders are chosen for performance rather than policy, and that the republic of Jefferson and Lincoln has turned into a reality show of ambition. Jeffrey Sachs would interpret this not as Trump's insight, but as America's confession through him. When a president, past or present, declares that the nation lacks talent, he is acknowledging a structural truth. The institutions of recruitment, education, and governance have been captured by short-term interests. For decades, the United States dismantled its own mechanisms of excellence. The public service that once drew its brightest minds now deters them with bureaucracy, partisanship, and distrust. The universities that once embodied civic mission have become corporations of prestige, burdening students with debt while teaching them to serve markets rather than the public good. Sachs would note that this is not a crisis of intelligence, but of integrity. The United States is still filled with scientists, educators, engineers, and thinkers of extraordinary skill. What it lacks is a moral structure that values them, a culture that rewards long-term vision over short-term gain. When politics becomes entertainment, when truth becomes a marketing strategy, the talented retreat into silence. Trump, in his way, is both the messenger and the consequence of this erosion. His complaint about a lack of talent is ironic, for it was his own ascent that epitomized the problem, a society that confuses visibility with virtue. Sachs might describe it this way: when power selects for spectacle, the wise will never appear on stage. And so America faces not a shortage of talent, but a famine of trust, a withering of the moral ecosystem that once nourished excellence. Trump's outburst, stripped of its cynicism, is the voice of a nation dimly aware that its decline is not technological or demographic, but ethical. The challenge, Sachs would argue, is to recognize that talent is not born in privilege, but cultivated in purpose, and that a nation that forgets how to serve cannot remember how to lead. Sachs would note that this is not a crisis of intelligence, but of integrity. The United States is still filled with scientists, educators, engineers, and thinkers of extraordinary skill. What it lacks is a moral structure that values them, a culture that rewards long-term vision over short-term gain. When politics becomes entertainment, when truth becomes a marketing strategy, the talented retreat into silence. Trump, in his way, is both the messenger and the consequence of this erosion. His complaint about a lack of talent is ironic, for it was his own ascent that epitomized the problem, a society that confuses visibility with virtue. Sachs might describe it this way: when power selects for spectacle, the wise will never appear on stage. And so America faces not a shortage of talent, but a famine of trust, a withering of the moral ecosystem that once nourished excellence. Trump's outburst, stripped of its cynicism, is the voice of a nation dimly aware that its decline is not technological or demographic, but ethical. The challenge, Sachs would argue, is to recognize that talent is not born in privilege, but cultivated in purpose, and that a nation that forgets how to serve cannot remember how to lead. The crisis that Donald Trump crudely summarized the claim that America no longer has talented people to run the country cannot be separated from the structural transformations that have hollowed out the American state over the past 40 years. Jeffrey Sachs would call this not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of design, the inevitable consequence of a society that turned knowledge into a commodity and education into a market. In the middle of the 20th century, the United States built one of the most remarkable systems of public knowledge in human history. Land-grant universities, federal research labs, and the GI Bill democratized education and nurtured a generation of scientists, engineers, and public administrators who carried the nation through the Cold War and the space race. But beginning in the 1980 seconds, under the twin ideologies of deregulation and privatization, the country began to treat learning as an individual investment rather than a collective good. Public universities became profit centers, student debt replaced public funding, and the federal government outsourced expertise to private contractors and lobbying firms. Sachs would see this as the marketization of competence, a slow, corrosive process through which the ethos of public service was replaced by the logic of return on investment. The bureaucracies that once attracted idealists now repel them with political hostility and inadequate pay. Meanwhile, the best graduates are absorbed into the engines of speculation, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the corporate legal world, where creativity is measured by quarterly earnings rather than civic outcomes. This shift has produced a society rich in technical ability but poor in wisdom. America does not lack skilled individuals. It lacks institutions capable of harnessing them toward the public good. The neoliberal transformation that promised efficiency has instead created fragility, a state that can wage trillion-dollar wars but cannot repair its bridges or reform its schools. Sachs would call this the privatization of genius, the redirection of the nation's intellectual energy away from public innovation and toward private accumulation. Education, the great equalizer, has become one of the engines of inequality. The average graduate carries decades of debt, while elite institutions hoard billions in endowments. The system that once elevated working class talent now reproduces class privilege. The result is a narrowing of the governing class, a meritocracy that selects not the best minds, but those most capable of navigating debt connections and branding. Sachs would point out that the tragedy of meritocracy is not that it fails to find talent, but that it confuses access with merit. This economic architecture has moral consequences. The idea of public service has withered. Young Americans who once dreamed of contributing to diplomacy, science, or education now confront a state that treats them as liabilities. Civil servants are derided as bureaucrats, teachers as overpaid, scientists as elitists. A political culture that mocks expertise inevitably drives talent away from the public sphere. Thus, when Trump claims that the country has no competent people, he is describing the outcome of policies, his own generation advanced policies, that starved the very institutions that made American excellence possible. Sachs would note the tragic irony: a society that worships the market will eventually sell its soul and then wonder why no one remains to lead it. The crisis of talent is, at its core, a moral economy crisis. The United States has allowed economic value to devour moral value. It has confused efficiency with purpose and profit with virtue. The talent exists, Sachs would say, but it is trapped within a system that rewards cunning over compassion, optimization over imagination. The task ahead is not to find better people, but to build a better order, one that reminds its citizens that knowledge is not merchandise and leadership is not a brand. The decline of talent in American public life is inseparable from the collapse of institutional integrity, a decay that Jeffrey Sachs would call the political economy of mediocrity. For decades, the nation has rewarded not competence but charisma, not service but spectacle. The system that once nurtured pragmatic administrators and visionary statesmen has devolved into the American Republic, Sachs would argue, now operates less as a government and more as a stage production democracy, as performance art. The consequences is profound. Talented individuals, those motivated by science, civic duty, or long-term vision, increasingly avoid public service altogether. The cost of entry, both financial and emotional, has become unbearable. Elections are billion-dollar rituals of branding. Policy work is suffocated by partisanship and lobbying. To enter politics today, one must abandon expertise for slogans, integrity for attention. As Sachs might say, the honest are drowned by the loud. This structural distortion did not emerge overnight. It is the cumulative product of decades of neoliberal governance, which stripped the state of both capacity and legitimacy. Beginning in the Reagan era, Americans were told that government was the problem, not the solution. That slogan became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Each budget cut, each outsourcing contract, each cynical campaign promise eroded public trust. The best minds turned away, leaving the field to opportunist politicians trained in outrage rather than policy. The result is a government rich in rhetoric but poor in results. Sachs would describe this dynamic as the feedback loop of decline. As institutions weaken, public trust collapses. As trust collapses, talented people withdraw. As talent withdraws, governance deteriorates further. The cycle repeats, each turn accelerating the hollowing out of the state. America's once vaunted bureaucracy, the engine of its space program, infrastructure, and social reforms, now resembles a corporate holding company, short-term contracts, transient leadership, and a culture allergic to accountability. This degradation extends beyond Washington. The same logic governs education, healthcare, and media, the conversion of every civic institution into a marketplace of attention. The rise of social media has only deepened the rot. Policy is no longer crafted in deliberation, but in reaction. Leaders govern by tweet rather than by principle. Sachs would warn that a nation addicted to spectacle will inevitably confuse visibility with virtue. Trump's lament that America has no talented people left is therefore both false and true. False because talent abounds in laboratories, universities, communities, and among the young who still care, but true because the corridors of power have become uninhabitable for such people. The system repels what it needs most. In a sense, Trump's statement is the unconscious confession of a political class that has designed its own irrelevance. Sachs might put it starkly: when a nation mistakes performance for purpose, it ceases to govern, it merely entertains itself while falling apart. The American decline, then, is not simply economic or strategic, it is civilizational, a corrosion of the moral and institutional scaffolding that once made competence possible. What the country confronts is not the absence of talent, but the triumph of distraction. And until governance rediscovers its dignity, the quiet craft of stewardship, even its brightest minds will find no place to serve. For nearly a century, the United States stood as the magnetic pole of global talent. It was the laboratory of modernity, drawing scientists from Europe, engineers from Asia, artists and philosophers from lands broken by war and tyranny. To come to America was to enter a covenant, the belief that intellect and creativity would find both freedom and purpose. But in the 21st century, that covenant has been quietly broken. Jeffrey Sachs would describe this transformation as the moral inversion of the American dream. Once the world's great incubator of genius, the U.S. has become a victim of its own arrogance, a society so convinced of its exceptionalism that it neglected the very institutions that sustained it. The universities that once welcomed global minds with open doors now close them with visa restrictions. The laboratories that once symbolized cooperation now compete for dwindling public funding. The government that once embodied optimism now exports cynicism and division. The erosion of America's global magnetism is not simply about policy, it is about trust. For decades, foreign students, scientists, and entrepreneurs viewed the U.S. as a meritocratic society, imperfect but open, competitive yet fair. Today, that faith has been replaced by apprehension. Political polarization, gun violence, cultural hostility, and the weaponization of immigration law have transformed what was once the beacon of opportunity into a fortress of anxiety. Why go to America, a new generation of students now ask, when innovation thrives in Singapore, Seoul, Berlin, or Beijing? Sachs would point out that this exodus of talent represents a silent geopolitical realignment. In the 20th century, the American empire was sustained not by territory, but by attraction, by what Joseph Nye famously called soft power. Scientists who built NASA, engineers who powered Silicon Valley economists, who shaped Bretton Woods, many were immigrants who believed in America's promise. But soft power cannot survive hypocrisy. As the U.S. retreats into protectionism, moral arrogance, and underfunded education, that invisible empire of inspiration has begun to collapse. Meanwhile, competitors have learned the lesson. America forgot that talent is the true infrastructure of civilization. China invests more in STEM education than any nation in history. India, despite poverty trains, millions of engineers and coders who export their expertise globally. Europe, though bureaucratic, continues to fund social and scientific innovation. Even smaller states, Finland, Singapore, the UAE, now design immigration systems that attract precisely the kind of thinkers who once filled American labs. The irony, Sachs would observe, is that the United States still imagines itself as the world's brain trust, even as its policies repel brains. The message of its leaders, America first, is heard abroad as the world last. What was once a philosophy of leadership has decayed into a posture of resentment. In moral terms, this is the price of forgetting that greatness is sustained not by dominance, but by openness. Economically, the consequences are already visible. The U.S. innovation edge is narrowing. Research productivity has plateaued. and the private sector, once fed by a constant influx of foreign talent, faces demographic stagnation. The talent pipeline that powered its digital revolution now flows eastward to Shenzhen, Bangalore, and Seoul. Sachs would argue that this marks a turning point in global history. The empire of attraction has given way to the competition of competence. Culturally, the loss is deeper still. When a nation that once taught the world to dream begins to teach it to fear something irreversible occurs. The story of American creativity jazz, Silicon Valley, the moon landing was always larger than its borders. It belonged to humanity. But a society that walls itself off both physically and morally ceases to be a frontier of imagination. Sachs might put it with melancholy precision: the world does not abandon America. America abandons the world, one visa, one wall, one cynic at a time. And so when Trump says that America no longer has talented people, he inadvertently names the result of a long historical drift, a world where talent still exists but no longer gravitates toward the American orbit. The stars that once circled Washington now burn in new constellations. The question Sachs poses is not whether the United States can reclaim its talent, but whether it can recover the humility that once made talent possible. For the real crisis is not intellectual but moral. The brightest minds of the world will not serve a power that mocks wisdom, commodifies truth, and fears diversity. Until America learns again that knowledge is a bridge, not a weapon, its decline in talent will mirror its decline in empathy, a tragedy of brilliance squandered by pride. In the final analysis, Donald Trump's lament that America no longer has talented people to run the country is less an observation than a mirror. It reflects not the absence of talent, but the collapse of moral purpose that once gave American talent meaning. The United States remains a land of extraordinary individuals, scientists designing vaccines, educators transforming lives, innovators advancing technology, yet their collective potential has been fragmented by a culture that prizes competition over community, visibility over virtue. Jeffrey Sachs would call this the moral eclipse of meritocracy. A society obsessed with success has forgotten why success matters. In post-war America, talent was tied to service to the building of a nation capable of leading by example. The moon landing, the Marshall Plan, the civil rights movement, these were not isolated achievements, but expressions of a shared national project. Today, that project lies in disarray. The most gifted minds design algorithms for attention, not cures for disease. The wealthiest institutions hoard resources while the public sphere withers. Leadership is no longer stewardship, it is performance art. This is what Sachs means when he speaks of the exhaustion of the moral imagination. America's elite culture still believes in excellence, but it no longer knows what excellence is for. The schools that teach brilliance do not teach empathy. The corporations that celebrate innovation do not practice justice. The result is a society rich in skill but poor in wisdom, a civilization that can predict the weather on Mars but cannot guarantee clean water in Flint, Michigan. For Sachs, this moral collapse is not terminal, but it demands humility, a willingness to rediscover the civic foundations of intelligence. True talent, he argues, arises not from privilege, but from purpose. It is cultivated when societies invest in fairness, education, and the common good. When a young scientist can dream without debt, when a teacher can live without despair, when a policymaker can serve without selling influence, then a nation rediscovers its competence. Rebuilding this moral economy of talent will require more than economic reform. It requires cultural repentance. The United States must learn to see education not as an industry, but as an inheritance. Public service not as failure, but as honor. Sachs would call for a new social contract, one that rewards the quiet dignity of contribution over the loudness of ambition, A country that measures genius by wealth, he reminds us, will always mistake cunning for wisdom. Globally, America must also recover what once made it magnetic openness, curiosity, and generosity. The rest of the world will not be inspired by a nation that speaks only of power. It will be inspired once again by a nation that listens, that builds alliances through knowledge and compassion. The next great export of the United States cannot be weapons or ideology. It must be trust. Trump's words, stripped of bluster, reveal a truth. He himself cannot see the decline of talent in American leadership is not destiny, but choice. It is the byproduct of decades of neglect of choosing spectacle over substance, wealth over wisdom, convenience over conscience. But decline is reversible. Nations, like individuals, can recover when they remember what. Sachs would close this reflection with moral clarity. The crisis of American talent is the crisis of American meaning. A society that forgets why it educates, why it governs, why it leads will inevitably lose those capable of doing so. To restore its genius, America must first restore its soul. The task then is not to search for better people, but to become a better nation, one that teaches its brightest minds not merely how to succeed, but why success must serve something greater than the self. Only then will the United States find once again the talent it fears it is lost, for it was never gone, only uncalled.